I'm going to start. I'm going to make a very small introduction because I want to give Kim as much time as we have. So Kim Johnson, known to us as Kim Marcus, a long-term member of Shomrei, is also a professor at NYU and has been doing work in this whole area of the urban and suburban divide, if I may. Kim tells me she's working on a book. We were talking about that. She's going to finish it next year on her sabbatical, and you'll be back to talk about it. And we're really thrilled to have Kim. Kim actually started this conversation with us probably a year ago when we were talking about how Montclair schools came to be Montclair schools. And Kim provided for us the context of what was happening in suburbia in the racial divide that we have here. And so today, Kim's going to take us further on that journey. Thank you, Kim.
Thank you, guys. This is kind of a story of why does Nutley not look like Belleville, which doesn't look like Bloomfield, which doesn't look like Montclair, which doesn't look like Essex Fells, which doesn't look like, can everyone hear me?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Which doesn't look like West Orange, right? And part of the story is most people say, well, they look different because they were developed at different times and different, sort of the market, right? The sort of real estate market is reflecting different preferences. What I'm going to argue is that the market, this is where I'm going to get kind of out there for some conservatives, that the market is actually shaped by choices that we make as the people, by government. And so what I'm going to talk about is the way in which our landscape of Essex County was very much shaped by choices made at the federal, state, and local level to allow people to live in some places, but not to live in other places. And from those decisions about where people are allowed to live also flow decisions about taxation, right? Can you tax a lot or can you tax a little? Because we know that property taxes are based on property values. And then if you think about why does Millbourne Short Hills have really excellent schools and maybe East Orange or Newark has less excellent schools, part of that story is resources, taxation, right? So deciding where people can live, what can be done in different places, really affects, at the end of the day, the things that you're able to provide for people who live in those communities. So I'm going to talk about how this all happened. So I'm going to start off with this map, and I'm going to start off with the story. So 1930 to 1940-ish, something really traumatic happened in the US called the Great Depression. Some of you lived through it, born in it, came after it, but this was a huge moment in the US because it really was even worse than, but much, much worse than, say, the 2008 Great Recession, because we didn't really have a lot of the sort of things like unemployment insurance or welfare or things that kind of make people's lives a little bit easier when economic times get tough. So one of the things that happens is that the housing market absolutely collapses. I'm going to just 2 seconds about the housing market. If you were building a house in Montclair in the 1920s, you had a couple of choices. You basically, so today imagine you get a mortgage by putting 20% down. In 1920, you got a mortgage after putting, say, 60 or 70% down. Wow. So this actually restricted home ownership to a pretty small percentage of the population. Sorry. You could do other things, and this is really fascinating. Sears actually sold kit houses, and Sears actually offered financing for the houses. So I don't know if I lived in a Sears house or not, but they're very distinctive, and you can see them all over. So Sears actually at one point was a holder of quasi-mortgages for a lot of houses. So the way that you bought a house was very difficult. And one of the things that the government decided to do is we need to make it easier for people to buy houses and to build houses so we can get people back to work. So one of the ways that we need to basically get a stronger, robust mortgage system is to have more standardized mortgages. And the way that you standardize mortgages is that you have to know that a house in Tennessee is going to be kind of built or assessed or seen as the same quality as a house that's built in New Jersey, right? So what do? We get lots of standardization. I mean, this is like very interesting but kind of bizarre, that if you go to any suburban house, chances are the pipes are all going to be a certain diameter. Chances are that the concrete footings will be built in a certain way. This is, again, to make sure that a mortgage that's put on a house in Kansas is going to be of the same, that house is going to be of the same quality as that house that's going to be built in Massachusetts. So so we have this sort of standardization of kind of quality, but then you also need standardization of space. That a house that's going to be built in Cleveland in a certain area will be equivalent to a house that's going to be built in Orlando of a certain area. And this is where it gets tricky. How do you determine the value of a house? So one of the things that was very prevalent, and this again, I'm talking about the 1930s, was a huge belief that people could be, people's race, ethnicity, and religion were actually kind of races. Like not racist, but racist. Like if you were Jewish, you were actually considered a different race. If you were Italian, you were considered a different race. If you were Irish, you were considered a different race. So, yes.
By who?
By
the government?
By the government.
Okay.
And sort of society. There's this huge belief that your language, in fact, was kind of a race. Alongside of this belief was that inharmonious races should not live together. And so, fundamentally, it meant that African Americans should not live with non-African Americans. And if we were talking about, say, the West Coast, Mexicans, which they were called, should not live with Anglos. And Orientals, again, this is a very different language, should not live with whites. So what the government essentially does is takes these beliefs, which are actually what were in the sort of mortgage underwriting codes officially until about 1968 or so. What the government said is, we're not going to insure mortgages if there is any kind of race mixing. It literally was written in the underwriting manual and not officially taken out until, I'm going to say, between 1966 and 1968. 68 officially because that's the enactment of the federal housing law. So if, for example, my family wanted to buy a house, we actually could not buy a house in suburban developments because that developer, in fact, was not allowed to sell because the FHA would say to a real estate developer, we're not going to let you offer FHA mortgages if you sell to inharmonious elements. So if you think about Levittown, he was like, and he actually was a quite liberal guy, but he said, listen, business is business. I'd love to sell to these African-American GIs who are coming home, but the FHA won't let me. I cannot sell because that would basically not allow me to offer FHA-supported mortgages. So it's FHA, VA, right? So if you think about, people are talking about this notion of the wealth disparity. If you are an African-American GI who came back from the war, you could buy a suburban house, but you would have to buy a suburban house in a segregated suburban development. Yes?
Private mortgages.
So what happens is because the government steps in, the FHA at this point, from then on until this point, is really about 80% of most single-family mortgages. So there are private mortgages, but those mortgages are not nearly as favorable as FHA mortgages. I mean, FHA mortgages really are an absolutely amazing deal when you think about it, because they're backstopped by the government. So this is how you get to things like the subprime mortgage crisis, right? Because these are private entities that are offering non-FHA backed mortgages. So you have to determine where people can live. And so what they did is they actually mapped about 200 or so major cities in the United States to figure out their risk rating, right? Because if you think about a financial instrument, the greater the risk, the more, and I'm not a financial person, but the greater the risk, the more or less money you can get, right? So you want to sort of, if you're the FHA, you want to minimize your risk. And so you're trying to figure out what areas are risky and what areas are not. So this is a map of Essex County that was created in 1937. And you see all these colors. This is Newark, here. And this spot right here is Montclair. This is Glen Ridge. This is Short Hills. This along here is Nutley, Bloomfield, Nutley, Belleville. This is East Orange. This is Irvington. Orange is next to it, and then this is kind of South Orange.
Can you put a spot?
What's that?
Put your hand on Montclair again.
Oh, so Montclair is from kind of here down. This is Bloomfield Avenue. All right, just to give you a sense. So this is Bloomfield Avenue, right? That kind of just goes.
What are the different colors?
All right.
Beginning.
This is the story. This is the story. All right. So each color corresponds to a risk. So up here is the little key. Green is first grade, Montclair. Blue is second grade. Actually, this is Caldwell Cedar Grove. Grade C is third grade, yellow. And pink or red is fourth grade. And hash marks are either sparsely built up or industrial, commercial, and then white is sort of undeveloped land. So these would be like the big parks, right? Southbound. All right, so this is the story. Why would a place be colored red? It's somewhat industrial, but more importantly, it has African Americans. Or if we were talking to the West Coast, Mexicans or Orientals. And in fact, it would only take one African American or Oriental or Mexican family to make that area red, except if they were servants. So there was the servant exception. So if you are in a red area because you've been infiltrated, and they would literally use this language of infiltration, of subversive races, you would be coded red, which means that the FHA would not, in fact, issue a mortgage for those areas, not even a rehab loan. So there's no publicly subsidized money to buy or renovate buildings in red-lined areas. So this whole notion of redlining, that's the red line.
But you also couldn't live anywhere else.
What? And you couldn't live anywhere else either. So what made a green area, the top area? Well, they were called all-American areas. They were called restricted areas. They were called all sorts of things that essentially said that we will only, that either through custom, realtors deciding to not sell to other people, but also through things like covenants, property, that things are written into the title, that non-whites, and by non-whites also I'll include Jews, were not going to be able to buy in these areas. And so if the examiners didn't into the area and said, okay, they're going to keep this area pure, safe from infiltration. I mean, the language is just remarkable. Then we're going to give you first grade. Second grade is, well, you know, it's mostly white, but maybe the buildings are a little bit older. C, so the other thing I should say, and then I'll actually hand out this. C is you have kind of not quite white people. And in the case of New Jersey, Italians. They were obsessed with Italians. And so you could have 0 black people, but if you had 10% Italians, I mean, so Belleville, no blacks, but Italians. So not red, but definitely yellow. So that's part of the story. So what I'm going to hand out, and I'm sorry, I just did one handout. It's actually a packet. But maybe,
So should we give it out or not?
well, people can just kind of quickly look through it. I'm going to explain what it is. So these are summary sheets of each community in Essex County. And what it says is a description, an industry, business conditions, financial institutions, population, taxation, assessed value, bonded debt, residential structures, dwelling units, new construction, sales. It really is kind of like, you know, when you go into Zillow, it's the stuff that you find on Zillow. Except, of course, it has like weird, icky language about race and ethnicity. So here is, I'll start with Montclair, because here we are, right?
When is this dated from?
This is from 1937, about.
Same as the map, right?
The same as the map. So, but, you know, there are a series of maps that are created between, say, 1934 to 1940. So this is Montclair. Description. Located in the northwestern part of the county, this town has long been known as one of the most beautiful and wealthiest of the country's metropolitan suburbs. Excellent commutation facilities to New York City. There's no industry to speak of, but there are major local facilities. Financial institutions. 3 banks with assets of $34.2 million. This is the depths of the Depression. So this tells you something, right?
Can you repeat that? What you just said?
So this is there's 3 banks.
3 banks.
3 banks with assets of $34.2 million.
Yeah.
As well as a mutual savings bank, assets of $12.3 million, and 3 building and loan associations with assets of $1.3 million. I should say that the building and loan associations were probably the ones who would most likely give mortgages to lower income folks, while the big banks would give the mortgages with higher income folks. Population in 1930 was 42,000. So we actually have, I think, slightly less now. I think we're 39,000. Families, 24.1% foreign-born, 13.6% Negro. With the exception of the substantial number of Negroes and foreigners, largely Italian, who are mainly gardeners, chauffeurs, and other domestic help, the major part of the population consists of business executives, professional men, etc., commuting to New York City and Newark. Average incomes of these are in the upper to top brackets. The fact that 4.6% of the population were benefiting from direct relief at the end of 1938 is accounted for by the comparatively large number of foreigners and Negroes. So it's also, at this point, how many people are on direct relief, which is the sort of initial welfare. Because again, 25 to 30% of the U.S. population is unemployed. It's the Great Depression. So then they have valuations, bonded debt, residential structures, etc. State of the market, overhang, rentals, mortgage financing. Montclair has long been considered a prime lending area with no type of lender having anything approaching a monopoly, local banks, etc., etc. Intrinsically, Montclair has lost none of the characteristics which have made it a suburban area of the highest type. From the standpoint of its larger estates, it is suffering somewhat from the long-term tendency to move farther from urban centers and the present reluctance of people of large incomes to take on or carry expensive establishments. So even then, the huge buildings up on Upper Mountain, people are like, oh, that's a lot of money. So some things don't change. This same general tendency to smaller living quarters applies all down the line. It hits particularly such communities as this. In summary, it may be said that while under normal conditions, Montclair should hold its high caliber, a continuance of present trends may well carry further down. So you see a little bit of the kind of Montclair real estate market that people start actually tearing down these large houses because it's a lot of money to carry these houses. But anyway, so if we go to Newark, Newark is obviously a larger city. It's got lots of industry. But what they say about Newark, the problem is that it's a city. So they actually don't really talk about race because really much of Newark has already been downgraded, fundamentally downgraded. So if we were to switch to Belleville, I'm just trying to give you a sense. So Belleville is really quite interesting.
Can I ask a question about
Sure.
Newark?
Yeah.
Why would a city be downgraded by definition?
Because it's primarily industrial, and there's lots of foreigners and black people. So there's no growth. So if you were actually to look at a map of New York City, it would basically look like this with pockets of, say, green in places like Riverdale in the
I
Bronx.
see, okay.
So most central cities are downgraded, which actually has a long-term effect that investment doesn't really happen in cities.
Not residential. You mean not residential?
Residential.
But not residential, yeah.
Right.
Can you
which-
get closer to the mic?
Sorry.
We're having trouble
So-
in the back.
Okay, so, yes, yes.
Trying to get to the mic
Yeah.
here, but if you're redlined and you're
Mhm.
African American,
Mhm.
you can't get a mortgage. How do you buy a house at all? Or you don't? just
You
rent?
buy it through
Say,
African American Bank.
Okay.
But, you know, the terms probably won't be as good. And it's not to say that African Americans aren't buying houses, but they're buying houses in segregated areas, which means that at the end of the day, what they found is that houses owned by minorities tend to be considered of less value. And they actually just did a study that came out 3 weeks ago, where they would show people the exact same house, and they'd say, oh, this house is worth about $300,000. And then they would actually show like a black person or white person standing next to the house, and the black house would be undervalued by $30,000. And so one of the things that people have traced is that the sort of property values over time between the different levels have stayed fairly same. So even though, say, property values have increased, the gap between property levels essentially stayed the same. And you only start to see convergence between, say, the red line and the green line after 1968, when discrimination was outlawed. So this has a long-term effect, right? Because if you are in a yellow area right? So you're not Newark, but you're Belleville or Nutley, your property taxes can only go up a certain amount. And so you're only going to be able to give your school district a certain amount of money. And so when we talk about the gap in school spending, a lot of it is fundamentally rooted in these differences of who gets to live where and how much resources that they're able to get from their property tax. So this is the story. So if we're going to think about why do we have things called Abbott districts, which don't exist anymore, but this school equalization, one reason for school equalization is that suburbs, not just cities, but suburbs like Orange, East Orange, people in Passaic County, all these suburbs are saying, listen, we have kids, we don't have the property taxes to really give adequate resources to our schools. And we need more money to sort of equalize things. And so that is the path that New Jersey took. Because another path would be, well, why don't we just make it into much larger school districts, i.e. integration. And in fact, New Jersey was moving towards that path. And essentially, suburban districts said, no, let's just sort of give them money rather than allow for integration. So one of the interesting things is if you go to places, say, in the South and the West, where school districts are county-based, you actually have more equity across schools. Because, for one, and this is where I'm going to make the pitch, when you have county districts, your taxes are lower. So we have in-laws who live in Colorado, much larger houses than we had, whose taxes are literally a fraction. Why? Because it's a county tax base. And the schools are great, but it's county level. So that's sort of not quite housing, but it is one of the peculiarities of the Northeast, and especially New Jersey, is this extreme fragmentation, which makes things super expensive. So instead of one big fire district or one big police district, you have 15 different police districts with 15 pension systems. I mean, I grew up in California under county systems. I never felt unsafe. I felt like if there was a fire, and California has fires, I never felt that there wasn't going to be responses. So there's a lot of kind of institutional, I would argue at this point, kind of dysfunctionality that leads to a feeling that we pay a lot of taxes and it's not quite clear what we get from it. But I think at the fundamental level of educational access, it is rooted in these decisions to allow some people to live in some places and other people to be forced to live in less equitable places.
But you were saying that was all over the country.
And it's all over the country. It is all over the country.
Certain places just got the memo to go countywide earlier than
right.
Okay.
But in some places, particularly in the South and the West, because they were relatively less developed, it was just sort of county government from the very beginning. So this is kind of like a long historical kind of like almost colonial days kind of overhang. And the other thing is that all these communities actually used to be part of Newark, and as they got more funds and higher income people, they actually decided to break away because they didn't want to share their tax revenue with Newark. So really, this actually was all Newark. It's Glen Ridge, Montclair, Verona, etc. So if you think about it, a place like Phoenix by sort of just square mileage or whatever, is one of the largest cities because essentially when you develop this area, so this is the Caldwells, very lightly developed, it automatically is already part of Phoenix, right? If you think about a place like Houston or Dallas, right? These are just enormous counties that any new development happens under one kind of taxing system. So that is the peculiarities of the East Coast versus, say, the South and the West. So I'm going to hand this out. The dog-eared one is Montclair.
Well, Kim, you were going to read Belleville.
Oh, right.
Since I just moved to Belleville, I have a very direct interest.
All right. So description: located on the west bank of the Passaic River, adjacent to and north of Newark. Riverfront about 1 mile. Area 3.3 square miles. Industry: considerable industry of varied character and small to medium size, including Westinghouse Electric and Manufacturing. The lamp division has been attracting some new industries of considerable importance. The average wage in Belleville, this is implicit, doesn't really make sense. Population is not dependent upon local industries, as large a proportion is employed in Newark and elsewhere. Employment is fair, with 5.4% of the population benefiting from direct relief. It has 2 banks with 6.3 million in assets. Right. So remember, Montclair has 34 million in assets. The population is probably it's 26,000.
But still, that doesn't account for it.
Yeah, it's half. Right. But 6 building and loan associations.
So that's the poor end.
That's the poor end. So again, you see these different financial access to credit based on different kind of financial institutions. that are located in these places. Population, families are 35.4% foreign-born, i.e. Italian, 3.6% Negro. Low to medium incomes, chiefly artisan and clerical. So again, when you look at the sort of landscape of Belleville, the reason the houses look different is that they were built for lower income people versus Montclair, right? So the assessed valuation of property in say Belleville is 29,000. I'm sorry, 29,000. It's if we were to go to Bloomfield, the assessed valuation is 68, right? So assessed valuations is what the sort of property tax rate is based on. And again, if you were to chart this, the assessed valuations don't really change all that much. So what does this mean? It means that actually one way to get more property taxes is to encourage commercial development. So this, I know this is a big issue in Montclair. Oh, we're overbuilding. But the commercial property is used to offset the residential property rates, which is why Paramus has really low taxes, because Paramus is a gigantic shopping center. So again, just something for folks to think about as you debate whether or not to allow certain kinds of development. Under the system of taxation, the only way, if you're going to keep the fragmented system, the only way to keep your property taxes stable is, or to go down, which doesn't really ever happen, is to allow for more commercial development. That's just the way it's, or to try to get more money from the state. Good luck with that. All right, so I'll finish Belleville. The market there is very slow. There's a lot of, actually relatively a lot of foreclosures, rentals, mortgage financing, general comments. Modest community, well located and with a comparatively stable outlook. Real estate overhang is heavy, caused largely by overbuying, and tax rate is high. So again, these kind of fundamental discrepancies and shortcomings are start to be built into this landscape. I'm trying to find the one where they were kind of like, too many Italians. It really was just kind of.
Must have been maybe Nutley.
Maybe it's Nutley. Yeah. Maybe it's Nutley. I can't find it. And the other thing is that there's lots of these that were written at different time points, and I think this particular set might not be the one I was looking at where I was like, whoa, that's a lot. So, yeah, I'll leave it at that. So, I mean, this story, I think, is one that I think is now just starting to be told. There's a great website called Mapping Inequality, where you can put in your city, and it will actually pull up the map for that city. And there's another website that's sort of being created that's linked to it, which will actually then show urban renewal. So urban renewal basically, so once these maps are kind of made, and once people start to say this area is worth more than other areas, then you can start to say, well, this area is undervalued. It's not being used for its quote unquote highest and best use, so therefore we need to engage in urban renewal. And so we need to clear this area and create new types of businesses and residences.
When did that start happening?
That started in late 1940s, but mostly takes off in the 1950s. And so what you see is that these red areas become urban renewal areas, and largely minorities are displaced from these red areas. So what then happens is that as Newark tries to through urban renewal, and African Americans are pushed into places like East Orange. So East Orange is an interesting story because East Orange, until about 1940, was actually one of the wealthiest suburbs in the United States. It is hard to imagine if you were to go down, I think it's not Bloomfield, but Springfield Avenue, it was the most fashionable shopping district in Essex County. It had all sorts of fancy stores, for what I've been told from people who grew up in the area. Now, not so much. And one reason is that they are kind of feeling the effects of being essentially more or less downgraded. And there are, as African Americans move to the north because of the Great Migration, there's not enough space in New York. And so they start moving into these kind of red areas outside. So certainly Montclair's African population increases, so does East Orange. So at the back of this is a couple of maps where East Orange is very worried about maintaining its status as an elite suburb. And so what they start to do is they actually start to track where African Americans and Italian families are living. Because again, you don't want Italians or African Americans in your town because they're seen as And Montclair too. So Glenfield Middle School was the school for African Americans and Italians. And they did not offer pre-college, college track classes. So then when you were going to the high school and you were smart Italian American or smart African American, you said, I'd like to take up the college track. They'd say, well, you didn't take any college track prep classes. Well, because there weren't any offered, because Glenfield was considered the school for Italians and African Americans, and it would be sort of more like a trade school. So even in Montclair, there was this segregation, which led to the big case in 1968, which is that folks on the South End, African Americans and Italians, who weren't already kind of starting to move out, essentially said, you've put us into schools where there aren't equal resources, and we cannot go to the high school and be placed into college track classes because you essentially didn't allow us to take college track classes. So I mean, think about the debate. I see some younger folks here. The math debate, right? And the tracking of math, right? If you don't get into a certain algebra class in middle school, so all these folks who've had middle schoolers, then you can't get into the college track in high school. So imagine you're at Glenfield and there's no algebra classes being offered. So again, I mean, this is a big story globally, but I mean, even in these places. So East Orange is very much worried about not being infiltrated and losing its sort of economic status. So they actually literally start to track. I found this great map with little dots with families. So someone had to go out and literally look for these people and figure out where they live, right? And then they come up with a map, which this is a map. The dark spots are the non-white areas. And this map appears in a planning document in 1940. By 1950, they realized that this is super problematic and the map disappears. This is real fascinating, right? But I'm like, I got the receipts. And then they decide that these are the areas that are in need of redevelopment. And lo and behold, there are areas where non-whites live. And the same thing happens in Montclair. But Montclair proposes an urban renewal project, which just so happens to coincide in the Fourth Ward. In both cities, both towns, African Americans said, isn't that curious? No, and stopped a lot of it. And so when you even think about that area around Bay Street, that is actually this fight between Montclair African Americans and sort of the white power structure to say, well, you can't just simply erase this area and force us to leave the town. Because what people have found is that urban renewal and suburban areas were largely used to get poor and non-whites out of suburban towns. Yes?
Where are Jews in this?
Where are Jews? So, where are Jews? So what's interesting, and I again, there are different summaries for at different time periods. And I have way too many documents and they're not, organized in my Dropbox. So what really is fascinating is that in, not this packet, and I'll just start, just passing, not in this packet, but in other packets, what I found is that Maplewood was considered Jewish, and so and that was one reason why it was actually lesser than Short Hills, which was considered waspy. I was told I'm not supposed to use waspy anymore than that. It's like, yeah, you're not, which I guess I get it.
Anglo-Americans.
Anglo-Americans. Yeah, Anglo-Americans.
That is a different meaning. I don't think it works. It literally means English. It literally means English people, not white people in general. I don't think it works.
Okay, well,
Whatever.
I think wasp works perfectly well.
Right, but it's not kosher. So it's actually interesting that some areas are seen as emergent Jewish areas, and that's sort of literally kind of written into this. And so what's interesting is that you do see Jews moving into particular communities because they're seen as Jewish than non-Jewish. Again, Glen Ridge is seen as all-American.
Yeah, that's the term.
And so for those of you who live in Glen Ridge, how different is it? It's changed a little bit, but a little, right? And so, it is a landscape in which race and ethnicity and religion is very explicit, but not, I think, in the way that we would want it to be explicit. It really is used as a way of sorting people. And it's, again, not just the East Coast, it's the West Coast as well. That there are relatively less African Americans, but in the West Coast, particularly in LA, the fear was having Asians, quote unquote Orientals, move into neighborhoods because they were seen as subversive, especially kind of pre-World War II. And the West Coast had its own long-standing anti-Asian sort of discrimination going along, and as well as Mexicans. They were seen as really just, but not Italians. So it really, again, depending on the region, the region had certain groups that were considered sort of subversive and negative influences that would need to be excluded from these areas. Lots of questions. I'll start over and go across.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah.
I noticed the big blue for the Caldwell.
Now to do.
I'm just noticing the big blue area, which
Right.
you said is the Caldwells.
Right.
And that is so white even today.
Right.
So why is that not green?
So what happens then is I'm a developer, and I'm building a new development out in Livingston or Caldwell. And part of my financing, the way that I get people to buy into my new development, is I offer FHA financing. That FHA financing is contingent on not allowing non-whites to buy. So up through the 1960s, you would see these ads saying FHA approved, restricted development, your property values will be protected. I mean, it's really incredibly explicit. So this is one of the things that the 1968 Federal Housing Act essentially says, no, you can't say any of those things. And you can't discriminate based on race and mortgage access to mortgage. So it's blue and it's white. So the blue areas are sort of the areas that are open for development, but they are white because of the sort of grading that happens and the new construction that's based on exclusion.
Isn't green the same though? I thought
Green is largely places that have already been built.
Right, so that's what it is, that they don't know.
Yeah, so they don't know, although it is. So this actually little red thing, this red island, that's the, old mental institution. Yeah, which is fascinating. Yeah, all right, so I'm gonna go across, yes.
You keep talking
Or
about
do you wanna?
FHA
Stand up, Al.
policies.
Stand up.
FHA policies.
Right.
What happened when they introduced VA?
Same thing.
mortgages? Same thing.
Same thing, same underwriting.
policy.
So it's underwriting policies.
Because that was,
Right.
was a major increase in housing.
Right. So if you were to get a college textbook for future underwriters, it literally has it in the textbooks. Like how to be a good underwriter would be a whole section on protecting property values through exclusion. Yes.
One thing I remember hearing when I first moved here, I remember hearing,
Could you stand up, please?
I'm sorry. When I first moved here, I remember hearing that in Glenridge,
Uh-huh.
you could not rent out, you couldn't have like 2-family houses. That
Right.
but in Montclair you could. So was that part of, did that kind of law or whatever, is that part of trying to keep the rating?
Right, so rating is actually based on zoning. And actually one of the first zoning laws in the US was a zoning law in Cleveland, it's called Euclid v. something, where Euclid, a high-income suburb, actually tried to stop apartment buildings from being built. Because the idea is that apartment buildings bring in outsiders, transients, foreigners possibly, but people who aren't committed. And so, again, we see this overhang where people are like, oh, too many rental buildings. And so part of the sort of security would be limiting the number of apartment buildings. Certainly only allowing, for example, say in this area, one way that you could sort of ensure that you can keep the area up for income is you don't allow apartment buildings. You have minimum lot, so 1 acre or 5 acre. You don't put in sidewalks, right? There are all sorts of things that happen via zoning that also work to exclude without being explicitly racially or ethnically based. So Glen Ridge, no 2-family houses. Although there's a couple, like kind of right near that little hub. But that might have been, those might have been built before they kind of put their foot down. Jennifer.
Yeah, so, sorry, I hate when people use it, because this isn't really a question. It's something from my own family history that I was just going to share. So one of the stories my parents told over and over and over again when I was growing up was how they went, my mother was pregnant with my brother, number 3, and they had a teeny tiny rental house. They went looking for a family house in Washington, D.C. Fell in love with a house in Spring Valley. They couldn't buy it. There was a covenant, no Jews allowed.
Right.
Bet those people are sorry now.
Well, I mean,
in my own life.
Right, so racial covenants, so these are things written into the title. I'm fairly sure that the house we had in Montclair, I'm pretty sure. I kind of want to see, I kind of don't want to see. Because we were the second owners and they had a Daughters of the American Revolution thing on their wall, and we actually got, it was actually quite cute, we got a Christmas card from George and Laura, and our son Milo, who was like 3, was like, a Christmas card from like the president. He put it on his wall, and I'd say goodnight to Milo and George and Laura, and it was all very lovely.
He hasn't changed, has he?
Well, he's yeah.
And after the war, a lot of the large estates in Montclair were redeveloped into garden apartments because of the vets.
Right.
And this was a decision that was made for the benefit of the future of the township. 44% of people now in Montclair are renters. Okay, so how did they, in that period of time, overcome this kind of redlining and were able to build these multi-story buildings and actually open them to multiple races in terms of rentals?
So these buildings were actually not open to African Americans. So there's actually a lot of local articles where the town says, okay, we're going to allow rezoning, that these large estates aren't economically viable, there's sort of a drain, they've been semi-abandoned, and so we need to sort of stabilize the tax base. We'll allow these garden apartments, but the garden apartments would not be open to black vets. So there's a huge fight in Montclair, a huge fight in East Orange about black veterans saying, you know, hello, we're from Montclair, we're from East Orange, and why can't we move into a garden apartment? So the integration doesn't really come until really 60s, but officially 68. And I think actually New Jersey passes like a housing anti-discrimination law, but it's more symbolic than actual teeth.
Okay, just personal anecdotes. Okay, personal anecdotes.
Though, let me just say, in my field, multiple anecdotes become anecdata. So
1960, I started looking for a house in Bergen County, found a great place. The realtor said, I was pregnant at the time, said, you'll love the house, but your children will never be invited to a birthday party. Okay, that was the end of that. Then we came to Montclair, bought property in 61. It was on the property, it was an upper mountain, on the property of an abandoned estate. People had moved to Essex Fells, and the property was divided into 3 parts. Fine. 5 years earlier, so that would put it about 56, people across the street, a Jewish family from Patterson, who we knew, had bought their house, a finished house, through a straw.
So what was that?
A straw is a non-Jewish person saying, I'm buying the house, and then immediately turning it over to somebody else. So that was what was happening in that period of time.
So it would happen for African Americans as well. I'm sure you would get, maybe a coworker, someone that you knew who would be your straw buyer. They would buy the house and immediately turn it over. And depending on the neighborhood, they'd be like, well, we're not particularly happy. Or they would literally throw rocks, or in the process there actually was like a cross-burning in East Orange. Because a black doctor actually got a straw buyer to move into, one of the nicer houses in East Orange. And this is probably in the 20s, so it's not, relatively speaking, not
So I want to offer my personal data because I love these stories.
Right.
1969, I was a graduate, 68, 69, I was a graduate student at NYU working at Montclair State, doing my field work there. And so David and I were getting married and we were going to move out to Montclair. So the woman said, my supervisor said, go to this great apartment building, which is one of the buildings, one of the old pre-war buildings, great building. I go, I'm, New York City kid, and they give me the application. And probably, 10 lines from the bottom, it says race. And I'm like, what race? It was like, did not compute, although New York has its own segregation issues. So I took the application and I brought it to my supervisor and I said, what the hell? Who does this now? This is probably the first half of 69. So she says, okay, are you willing to do some testing? Because Montclair at that point was really big in fair housing testing. I said, oh yeah, good. Can we pick it now? So David and I went back. We filled out the application. We came back. We were a cute couple. I don't know if they knew we were Jewish, but there we were. And they said the house will be, the apartment will be available and blah, blah, blah. And we said, we're not sure. Thank you. And then following us came another very cute couple of color. And the answer, of course, was, and he had, the African-American guy had a briefcase. He looked really much more professional than David. And he had a tape recorder, because in those days we used these tape recorders, right? And so they taped it. And of course, then it became one of the cases in the fair housing. But it was one of those moments of, is this still happening? 69.
But it's still happening. It is still happening, and it's now called steering, right?
Yes.
Where people are sort of saying, "Oh, you'd be really comfortable here," or they might not even show. That's changed because of Trulia and Zillow, which, in its own ways, put a lot of transparency into what's available. But again, it is people. They still do this, but not as explicitly. At least here. I mean, I'm sure in other parts of the country,
So I was going to, that steering thing is that I was going to share. So we moved, we started looking in Montclair in 2001. I think it was 2001. And so fairly, much more recently. And there were, we didn't really know anything about Montclair and sections of Montclair. And I think about where we were shown. And so years later, when the Greensteins, bought their house where they bought it, it was like, oh wow, really, there were no places that were available, and there were I started to realize there were whole areas of Montclair that we had never been shown, and there must have been.
Yeah.
There must have been homes available. So I think that steering, I would guess, maybe it's happening less in Montclair, but I would guess that that's how
Well, but
it's still a lot.
It could be steering that, wow, you guys seem to have more money,
Yeah,
so we're going to try and have some. So,
Yeah.
you know, and I mean, I know for us, we were very clear, like we had to be near a train station because we both commute.
Yeah.
So that kind of takes off the southern part of town because we needed to be near a train station. Yeah. And then I'll get to you in a second. Actually, no, I'm going to have, and then I'll get to you after this one.
Can you explain the
Stand up, please, for the record.
Can you explain the issue with, I'm just very curious about Italians, like what's up with the Italians and why not Irish, Jewish? Is it because there were so many Italians in Essex County and like what was up with that?
You know, in an interesting way, I think Italians, I mean, so Irish have kind of been immigrating to the States since 1830, 1840.
I see.
So they kind of have become more assimilated. And I think Italians, I mean, so it's interesting, like, if you just think about immigration and when it happens and the kind of economic class that immigrants enter into. So Italians come to the U.S. as laborers. Think about, one interesting thing is, for example, if we think about Indian Americans, Indian Americans.
Right.
In the U.S., they largely come as professionals. In the UK, they came in as laborers. So really kind of how you come in, how you immigrate, really shapes kind of initial impressions. So not only are they recent, but they're laborers, less educated, and quite frankly, they're kind of darker. I mean, there's that too. So I think there's this real like Italians, and I have this funny story. So settlement houses, which were places where they were trying to help.
Just an observation about what you're saying.
Alan, wait.
When I was thinking.
Let her finish.
No, I'd comment on that, so if you may want. It's just a comment that at 19th century into the early 20th century, Italians, Jews were not considered white by the general population. I don't know if that has any effect on this.
No, it's true. So there's this, it's called whiteness studies. But so certain groups weren't considered white. They were, and again, you think about like where did the Nazis get all this? It's this whole gradation where your nationality is a race. So the Serbian race, and you're like versus the who are they fighting against?
Croatian.
The Croatian race, and I'm like, yeah, you look all the same to me. But so it really sort of like, so it is this kind of, it's very, very odd. But yes, certain groups were considered less white, and then there were definitely non-whites, African Americans, Asians, Native Americans. So two funny stories that I found about settlement houses, where settlement houses tried to get Italian immigrants to stop cooking with olive oil because it's seen as gross and disgusting and unhealthy and un-American. And then 2 days ago, I found this funny little quote about Jews and pickles and how it was unhealthy, and they seem to be obsessed and maybe addicted to pickles. I mean, it's crazy. So, none of this makes any kind of rational sense, right? But nonetheless, this irrationality gets put into public policy. Yes?
Well, we were looking for our first house in Montclair.
And Montclair, woo! I mean, we think about Montclair's crazy.
We saw where houses were available. The realtor said, oh, they don't allow Jews on that street. Wow. So my question to you is, was that an agreement among realtors, among the seller of the house, or what? We were not smart enough to ask why.
It depended on the area. Sometimes
it was in Upper Montclair.
Right. So sometimes it was just sort of what's called a gentleman's agreement, that you, as a realtor, you would agree to not do these things, and you would agree, A, because you believed in it, but B, also you wouldn't have access to other listings, and other realtors wouldn't do business with you. So if you're a realtor who decides, you know what, I'm going to sell to this Jewish family or American family, you're taking a huge risk. You're essentially kind of knocking yourself out of the lucrative general market and putting yourself into a niche real estate market. In some areas, particularly the South, African Americans and other minorities actually couldn't join the local Realtors Association. And so, it really was just this incredibly segregated world. And in other areas, there were racial covenants, neighborhood covenants. It really just depended on the area, the ways in which they would try to enforce racial/ethnic and religious separation. But a lot of it becomes kind of we'd call self sort of justified, like, well, I'm not going to be the one to ruin the sort of property values. You know, who am I to make that decision? And even this notion of blockbusting. I mean, one person's blockbusting is another person's opportunity. Mm-hmm. I mean, that's another way of flipping that idea. And the argument is that, well, people are engaging in blockbusting to make money through panic selling, which could be true. But blockbusting is also people who are like desperate to get out of really bad housing situations and, you know, try to get into a better housing situation. I mean, what's odd about Montclair is that for African Americans, it was actually considered an open place. Mm-hmm. If you were an African American lawyer or doctor, there were very, very few suburban places where you could buy a really nice house. So if we think about Bullock School, which used to be the African American Y, this African American Y was one of the few in the North. Most were built in the South. Why was it built in the North? Because there were these incredibly well-connected African Americans who said, we'd like a Y. And they said, okay, we'll build one for you. The other place where it was built was at Evanston, which also had a large middle class African American population as well. So, you know, for all the exclusion and the segregation, Montclair, weirdly enough, was considered cosmopolitan in the sense that it tolerated certain groups, not the Italians. Mm-hmm. and so the reason Fortunato Field is called Fortunato Field, I have all sorts of crazy like local history, is that it was Italian American boy who like did well, and he was held up as like an exemplar of the Montclair Italian American community. But until him, Italians. Yeah.
We have, let's do 1, 2, 3, and then we
okay.
You also said that non-whites, including Jews, wouldn't be offered mortgages in those areas. That, like, why they were steered toward certain houses and with others,
right?
Because the
Could
lenders.
you stand up, please? You really
Yes,
can't,
because
you really can't hear over
the
here.
non-whites would not be
Right.
offered
Right.
mortgages.
Right. So you wouldn't be offered mortgages, right? I think Jews, it really depended. You could be offered a mortgage if you bought in the appropriate area. So African Americans would possibly get a mortgage, but it would have to be a mortgage that was offered on a house in the appropriate area. So they've actually gone back and looked at records and found these really interesting disparities in this historian Kenneth Jackson, who's done like history of New York City. His first book was actually looking at Essex County, and he was the researcher who actually discovered these maps kind of hidden away in the National Archives.
Wow.
So yeah, when I went to undergraduate, I remember reading about Montclair. Little did I know I'd end up in Montclair, but in Essex County, yes.
I wonder if you could just comment about the Mount Laurel decision. Has that made any beneficial impact on any of this?
Mount Laurel is a whole chapter in my book. So Mount Laurel is like the school equalization. Essentially, people said zoning is being used to essentially exclude people from opportunities. So if you think about 1970s, 1980s, all the economic activity is happening out in the suburbs. Cities are considered dead. So if you want a job, you need to be in the suburbs. But if you're stuck here, to get from here out to, say, retail jobs here is this incredibly long, torturous bus, maybe the 29 or something. It takes hours, right? And so people say, well, why can't we live here? And the towns would say, oh, no zoning, whatever. And so what Mount Laurel essentially said is that you towns have to provide housing. And it really was based, and it wasn't based on race, it really based on sort of lower income people, affordable housing. You have to allow for the ability to construct more affordable housing. I should say lower affordable. And it's incredibly contentious. It sort of is successful and then it sort of dies off, it comes back. I think Murphy just kind of revived it. And it really was an attempt to kind of push suburban areas to allow for multifamily housing, for townhomes. Because, you know, people should have the ability to be where jobs are. It's tricky because I think people have this belief if I have townhomes or apartments that will reduce my property values. Most studies have found it's just not true. But people are very much wedded to this idea that having economically homogeneous areas is somehow better. So Mount Laurel's was contentious, but what it largely has done is it's provided affordable housing for seniors. So a way that a lot of towns got around it is we'll allow apartment buildings, but it'll be age restricted. So the 62 and older Canadian developments are probably built under Mount Laurel guidelines.
Wow.
So they're affordable, but you know, it's like, oh wow, older Hispanic ladies, but you know, younger ones, they're not quite sure about that. So it's a start, but it's not a perfect mechanism for actually creating. It's creating economic integration. I'm not sure if it's really creating other kinds of integration.
Dale?
What are the What are the roots of micro-segregation in communities like here in Montclair? There's certain areas that are, you know, almost all black, and certain areas that are almost all white, and other towns. I mean, how did that start to happen?
I think there's lots of theories about that. I mean, part of it is could be sort of individual attraction / aversion. Like some people, they'll see that, oh, you know, African Americans could potentially be my neighbor, or others could say, oh, that's great, right? I even think about like our block, which had, I'm going to say 2 or 3 gay lesbian couples. You know, and it could be that, oh, there's already a couple on the block with kids. Wouldn't it be great to sort of live on this block? So at that sort of micro level, I don't know. I think at the neighborhood level, it could just reflect longer standing patterns of exclusion or inclusion. You know, I know that some of the areas in Montclair had been areas where quote unquote servants lived. And that kind of, so these kind of longer standing patterns kind of acquire their own kind of momentum. So you know, I'm not quite sure how that happens. And I know certainly, and then you could say that there's communities of choice, right? That if we were in, say, an Orthodox shul, right, it would not be unusual for this whole area to then become populated with Orthodox families. So it's just hard to tell at that sort of micro level. But I think what most people would say is that, you know, at that micro level, it's not clear what can be done, but we have to ensure at least that it's not, that discrimination is not happening, right? At that point, it really becomes very difficult. And in fact, there's kind of these weird kind of exceptions in the housing law that covers if you live in a 2-family. Apparently, there's a bit of leeway for you to sort of discriminate. It's very odd. So housing discrimination law is very tricky because I think the process of getting it enacted required kind of a number of trade-offs to get it enacted.
So was the biggest change in Montclair that happened during the school integration program? So in the 60s that happened, right? I believe that was
70s. So the case was in 68.
After Englewood.
Right. I'm Carol. The school case, the integration case, was that 68 that was filed?
It was early 70s. It was right after, and whoever knows the date of the Englewood busing case, that was right after that.
Late 60s is what we're hearing.
So late 60s, but I think actual implementation started in the early 70s.
And that changed the town? Did it change?
I don't think it necessarily immediately changed like the where people lived, but I certainly changed the school system in the sense that this is the really great thing, right? They rebranded Hillside as gifted and talented.
Yeah.
And Mount Hebron became sort of traditional schooling, which African Americans are more traditional schooling, and non-African Americans like to believe that their kids are all special snowflakes. But anyway. Well, I have a friend who's like, Montclair, the land where every snowflake is unique.
Kim, just on the school thing, just as an aside, again, a little bit of personal data information. At the time of the Montclair almost busing crisis, we had a superintendent of schools named Blanchard, and when it came near the point of litigation, he quit and he moved to Lily White, took a job in Lily White, Portland, Oregon.
Yeah.
That was what was happening here.
Yeah. No, it was the folks who were involved can give a much better, accounting. Yeah.
One of the interesting things about
stand up.
One of the interesting things about the school crisis was that it gave an opportunity for people like us to buy homes that we could afford in Montclair because the values had gone down. And then our wealth increased over 40 years.
Right. That's the sort of ironic yet troubling thing is that the prospect of integration actually lowers the property values. And then integration itself lowers the property values. And so one of sort of an ironic kind of outcome of this is that as more people sort of engage in a quest for good schools, which are coded as all white, it pushes up the costs of all whites districts. So in essence, people are paying more to live in an all white district, as opposed to, and this is the argument that people who are supporting vouchers make, if everyone just had vouchers, you would decouple housing prices from schools. You would decouple housing values from schools. You could live in a charming, historic mansion in Patterson, which actually has this very charming historic area, but you live there if you can afford to send your kids to private school, or you're like, we'll take our chances. And I should say, there are urban public schools that are not so great, but actually there are a lot of urban public schools that are perfectly fine. But again, there's this coding of race and education that makes parents who say, I want to do the best for my kid, to believe that doing the best for your kid is ensuring that your kid is in a classroom that is composed of certain groups of people. And so until we can kind of unpack that and say, all kids are different, all kids have different needs, and let's give resources so that teachers can deal with the different kids that are in their classrooms, then I think that would be the way that we start to unpack these things. Because right now, to afford to live in Short Hills, you have to make a lot of money, or you have a 2-income family, which means that both of you are commuting probably in order to afford that. And that, some people would argue that that means less time that you're actually spending with your kid. Or you're spending money to buy childcare, to give that social capital that you can't do because you're working. So, I think I like to believe that a lot of our issues could be actually resolved by dealing with the issue of integration and education.
Kim?
Yes.
So, building off of that, to what extent is the New Jersey unusual in funding schools through property taxes, so that those are completely linked? And is there a sort of the tax law now that limits the deductibility of taxes? Is there thinking that might long term actually decouple property values, property taxes, and funding for schools?
Well, so the whole tax change, that was to go after blue states.
Well, yes,
Yeah.
yeah.
But I mean, I think it could lead to two outcomes, right? It could lead to, we all kind of become more like red states and we just don't fund schools. I mean, to the extent that our in-laws live in Colorado, their taxes are low, but their school year is super short. We're like, you're out of school already. Like because they just, don't pay for school. And they go to a great school, but that school is pretty homogeneous. And it's full of, high income people that, are able to supplement that short school year with lots of other things.
So I'm going to bring this to a close. Start by thanking Kim.